Hello, good evening. As I said, my name is Denis Costello. I have been accused at one stage when I was promoted a few years ago of being a therapist who was masquerading as a manager. So my heart and soul is in working with people and helping people make sense of their lives and deal with the issues that trouble them. So I'm really going to talk in a sense about spirituality and mental health. And I'm going to try and make 4 major points. And hopefully I can remember them, and if I see me wandering back towards the stand here, it means I'm on page 2. And don't forget that I'm supposed to give a shout out for Father Ron Rollheiser at the end. I suppose I should start by saying what we won't be. So to cover all of mental health in 20 minutes is quite a trick, right?
There's no
so
more
you don't really expect everything covered. So I'm going to start by bracketing a large section that I won't cover. I won't do the major psychosis, schizophrenia, psychosis, personality disorders. These are major topics. I will touch on them to this extent. They begin to emerge in late teens and early 20s. You're beginning to notice schizophrenia will begin to emerge at that stage, and some of the psychotic breaks will begin to show up. It's terribly, terribly difficult to diagnose well at that stage, but it's absolutely vital. Because if you don't get an accurate diagnosis, then the treatment is very sketchy. So if you know people who are beginning to get into trouble, encourage them to get really good professional help and not to settle until they've got a proper diagnosis. What can you do? Give them hope. It's very frightening when your mind begins to go. I'm 67. Oh, I'm 68 now. The mind is beginning to go. It's not a lot of fun, I assure you. So it's very frightening when your mind begins to go. But it's terribly important that you give people hope. All is not lost. Many people with significant mental health challenges can be treated well. If they stay on their medication, they can have a good life. And in a sense, that's all I'm going to stay on that topic. Because it's way too broad, and it's really for a professional audience. Of course, I lost the blooming the TV, the camera. I have to go back to my notes, Vanessa. Okay, here I can't be heard. I'll get a bit better on the volume. So as I say, just to recap on the mental health side of things, on the major mental health, good diagnosis, give the person hope, and separate out the person from the illness. I have a bad back, but you are a schizophrenic. I have a sore leg, but you're a bipolar. It's very easy with mental health to label people, and then we stop seeing the human being. So then, what are the elements of good mental health, and how does spirituality lead into it? I'd say the first thing is lead a reflective life. Oscar Wilde said that only the shallow truly know themselves. So you have to balance between being shallow and blithely unaware of yourself and walking through life, knocking over things and people. And equally well, you can get equally stymied by getting so self-absorbed in a narcissistic kind of self-reflection. We need healthy self-reflection. It's the first start to good mental health and good emotional health and good relational health. Being able to take responsibility for who you are and how you relate both to yourself, your God, and to your fellow human beings. Now, in 2 days' time, we have Lent. And you need to know, I grew up hating Lent. First of all, it's in a dreary time of the year, and I'm prone to seasonal affective disorder and get down. Secondly, all it was about giving up things. And you'd give up sugar in your tea, and you'd give up chocolates. And then Easter Sunday would arrive and it would be like getting out of jail. We would gorge. That kind of Lent, I think, is a bit useless. Probably good for my figure, I could lose a few pounds here. But I got a moment of enlightenment a few years ago when I heard at the preface of the Mass, Lent was described as this great period of grace. And I think if we embrace Lent and self-reflection as a period of grace, then we begin to see that there are three things I can look to review in Lent. First is my relationship with God. What is my relationship with God? Am I always looking for stuff? Am I a kind of a greedy Christian? I mean, I used to have my aunt, the nun, pray for football teams, for goodness sake. And I really don't think that God is all that involved. I could be wrong there, but anyway. But what's my relationship with God? And more importantly, what's my relationship with God's will? Am I doing my own will, or am I trying to do God's will? I think for any adult, that's a really critical question. Very hard to discern, I will admit, but Lent a great time to find out what's my relationship with God. The next one is, what's my relationship with others? You see, I'm a busy man, so I can't really have a lot of time to sin. I mean, I always wondered about Jack Kennedy with his bad back, who was out and about a lot. I can't have time to be out and about and committing all of those interesting sins. So I only do the bad, mean ones, like get crabby with people at work and get crabby with people at home. Most of the sins you'll commit will be in your interpersonal relationships. The odd one of you, I'm sure, robs the odd bank, but most of us don't do that kind of stuff. We live a fairly normal, boring life. So we find our grace and we find our emotional and mental health in where we live now. So therefore, I would be saying the next area to look at in living a reflective life is, what are my relationships like with others? And then thirdly, what is my relationship like with myself? I'm going to talk a lot about that in a few minutes. But at this stage, what is my relationship like with my appetites, my desires? What is my relationship like with them? Are they in control, or are they driving the bus? Who's driving the bus of my life? And that's terribly important, because if you're going to have any kind of healthy self-esteem, if you're going to live an emotionally healthy and good life, you need to be able to have some solid basis on which you feel you're progressing, you're doing something, you're getting ahead with your life. And it's not necessarily about getting promoted up the ladder in your work. It's much more about having good relationships with God, good relationships with each other, and good relationships with yourself. So that's the first step in mental health. Lead a reflective life. I don't actually wing this, you know, I actually write the notes out. These are not blank sheets of paper to make me look smart. One last thing about Lent, very important. It only lasts for 40 days. We don't do it for 365 days. You'll have to get out there and live. You do the work of Lent and let it bring its fruit through to you during the rest of the year. Because your mental health and your spiritual health are always linked together. So the first strand of good mental health is living a reflective life. The second strand is learn about yourself and learn to manage your emotions and your thoughts. The first one in this, in learning to live with yourself, is what we call body dysphoria. Most people don't like their bodies. I'm either too tall. I never intended to be this tall. I did nothing for it, by the way. It's a true fact. Most of us have a struggle with our bodies. We're too tall, or too short, or too fat, or too thin. The white people are all trying to get brown, which we know is bad for us, but we're going to do it anyway. My feet are too big, I take a size 15, it's ridiculous. My nose is too long, my nose is too short. We have awful problems with body image, partly because of the culture in which we live, which says we're supposed to have an airbrushed body. Coming to some terms with that, I think, is critical. When you meet somebody who loves you as you are, it's a sacred moment. If we remember in the scriptures, Pope John Paul II brings us back in Theology of the Body to that original creation story. And he reminds us that Adam and Eve were naked and were without shame. And when somebody loves you as you are, in the lovely Leonard Cohen phrase, and sees you naked in your body and in your mind and loves you, that is a sacred, holy moment, because that is how God intended it from the beginning. So the first one then is to get to some sort of reasonable accommodation with your body. The second one is to be able to manage your own emotions. And I want to talk really about depression when I talk about that. When we talk about emotional regulation, I think of my next door neighbour, Maisie. Now Maisie is just about 3, and she is a hellion. When Maisie is happy, she beams. She lights up a room. She's magnificent, and she'll run and jump into your arms. But when she's grumpy, you can hear her in the next parish. When she's sad and falls, she wails. But Mary is just a little bundle of id. She has got to learn to regulate her emotions, and Brian and Megan are doing a terrific job. And she's a great kid, and that's okay at a kid's age. But as we grow up, we need to regulate our emotions. And one of the ones we find most difficult is dealing with feelings of depression. I'll talk really about 3 types of depression. The most common one you'll have heard of is seasonal affective disorder. Many of us go down during the winter. It may be in November when the leaves fall off the trees, it may be at Christmas, it may be at New Year's, or it may be, for me, when the snow goes and everything is muddy brown. I come from green Ireland. This brown of May and June, April and May drives me nuts. So we need to manage it knowing that we're liable to go down. For seasonal affective disorder, medication can work, but also exercise and a good attitude. Mentally telling yourself, this too shall pass. This happens, I get back down at this time of the year, it's not the end of the world. Then I get a bit of hope. The second type of depression I just want to touch on is dysthymia. That's a kind of a chronic, low-grade depression that a small percentage of the population has, and they are continuously depressed. It never kind of goes away. They never break through. It's a chronic, low-grade problem. Life for them is difficult, and life for their family and friends is difficult. They need your support. They also need either counseling or medication. You'll hear a lot talked about mindfulness and mindfulness ways with depression. It's really quite good. Any form of healthy reflection will work. But medication also seems to work as well. That's a chronic condition, and you will see some people with it. Interestingly enough, if you distinguish between men and women, and I decide to go out on a limb and get gender specific, many men, when they're depressed, turn it into anger. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, about men and rumination later on. So, the third is what's called, the third type of depression I will allude to, is when there's a major depressive episode. And this is when it comes down on you like a sheet of water. You're good, and seconds later, your world is grey. It's like somebody turned all the lights on. It's a frightening condition. These are the people who are vulnerable to suicide. Sylvia Plath, those of you, what was the movie the other couple of years ago on Sylvia Plath? Okay, lost that one. But this is when people are at risk of suicide. And this is where with teenagers, there's also a risk of suicidality. So major depressive episode, hospitalization, inpatient treatment, and possibly day treatment. And people who have one episode of a major depression are liable to have a second and get even more at risk on a third, because then they know how bad it is, and therefore they become a risk to themselves. It's always a safe question to ask a person. The polite way to ask, if you're worried about somebody, is to ask, are you a threat to yourself? Are you at risk? Are you a threat to yourself? And the standard rules when you're doing it then would be to say, if you are going to do something, to yourself, what would you do? And if they say, I jump in front of a truck subway, you say, next step, what's your plan? I'm going to hang myself on that bottle rope. So then you've started to put the plan into operation. At that stage, you pull the plug. You bring them to hospital, because they are now becoming a serious risk. But you won't trip somebody into suicide by asking. So the standard advice we give all our counsellors is ask and address the issue. See if they've thought it through, and see if they've implemented the plans. That's fairly true, and it's very traditional. More recently, I was working with a colleague who's done a lot of work on suicidality, and he talks about an impulse suicidality, where somebody makes a sudden and quick move. And very often, people who attempt suicide don't want to kill themselves. They want the pain to end. So it's not much help saying, do you want to kill yourself? Because the answer is no. But I do want the pain to end. So it's worth unpacking that a little bit. My colleague David is doing work on this. I saw the first draft of his book, he sent it to me, and it was 600 pages long, and so it was Christmas, and I'm afraid to say, I'm only about 30 pages in. But it is worth, be attentive to that. So those are the major depressions. The first cousin to depression is anxiety. Oh, just one, yes, I'll keep going on this one. The first cousin to depression is anxiety. Because anxiety and depression often have the same kind of circular thinking. In anxiety, it's an anxious set of thoughts. In depression, it's a negative set of thoughts. And for that reason, the treatment of choice for both are SSRIs or SNRIs. You'll know these as Prozac and those kinds of drugs. Sorry, I'm distracted a little bit. The anxieties can come out as generalized anxiety disorder, or it can be anxiety around a particular situation. If it's an anxiety like a social anxiety, cognitive behavioral therapy works, where a certain amount of self-talk and a certain amount of working through helps. For people who have generalized anxiety disorder, normally prefer to use something like Prozac and SSRI. They're less habit forming, and they don't create a chemical dependency. The tricyclics, or the using anything further than that really needs a lot of consideration. But you can get a good result with anxiety, but the lead-in time for those SSRIs is generally with depression 2 to 3 to 4 weeks, and with anxiety 4 to 5 to 6 weeks. It doesn't take the pain away, but it does manage it. I was talking to somebody a few months ago, and I said, so how's the medication working? And he says, it doesn't take the sadness away, but it helps me not cry all the time. in the reality of life, I think that was a good enough result. Let me see. So if you are with somebody who's getting depressed, know they can't pull their socks up, it's okay, I've done that page. Thank you. We're on page 4 as we go. But thank you very much. Okay, kind of covered. We've covered anxiety. And I think the thing that you as a friend can do is to give them hope. And that's going to be a theme that I'm going to talk a lot about this evening. For some of you, what I'll be talking about will be personal. For others, it'll be a friend or a family member or somebody you see through your work. I think the biggest thing is to be able to say, I have suffered one episode of clinical depression, I have suffered seasonal affective disorder, and I've suffered the dark night of the senses. They're all different. And it's actually okay to be able to say that because we all have those experiences. The fact that I have vertigo does not mean I have an anxiety disorder, it means I've got vertigo. And no, I'm not taking any medication, but I'm not going up on any ladders either. So, you begin to realize that there's hope with mental illness, particularly nowadays, when it's okay to talk about it. And the best way for you to talk about it is, if I can talk about it and be honest about what I've struggled with, there's no reason why you can't talk either. And so you begin to build a bridge. Because the person, remember I said, see the person behind the diagnosis. You want to build a bridge with people rather than make them feel they're lepers, they're outcasts, they don't really belong. So we've talked about the relationship with our body and how we have good health there. We've talked about the relationship with our moods, our emotions. I now want to talk a little bit about how we manage our... We doing okay for time? 5 minutes. Then I want to talk a little bit about how we mind what's in our brain. If I talk about if I use the term plasticity or neuroplasticity, is this over your heads or is this something you've heard about? You've heard about it, okay. Your representative over here is speaking for you. So you know there's neuroplasticity, and that's great because we know we can change and shape the way our brain functions. That's good news. Now the bad news. We can change our brain for good or for ill. That's the downside of neuroplasticity. Most of the time you'll change your brain for ill, like learning bad habits accidentally. So for good mental health, you need to be really careful about what you let into your brain. My friend Carl coins the phrase, I use the phrase, stinking thinking. One of the most destructive roles to cast yourself in life is to be a victim. Because if I'm a victim, I'm powerless, I'm disgruntled, I'm fed up, I'm PO, can't use stuff like that in theology on tap. Take that last line back. I'm fed up and I'm grumpy, and particularly if I'm a male, I can walk around stewing in this mess for an age. And that will erode your mental health quicker than anything else. It makes you really grumpy, really irascible, and it begins to skewer your thinking. Because remember, the brain gets habits. Neurons that fire together, wire together. You develop neural pathways and that becomes the way you think. I mean, I've never seen a teacher that didn't know more than her principal. I've never met a nurse that didn't know more than the doctor. And I never met a social worker who didn't know more than their supervisor. It's a bad way to think. It may be true. In my case, it probably is true, but moving right along. But it's much better to refuse to be a victim and be determined to be a survive to be a survivor. Survive and thrive. And therefore, if you mind your body and kept to some peace with that, if you learn to manage your emotions, and when they become overwhelming, do something about it and get professional help. And if you learn to be disciplined with what you let into your brain, you'll not only have good spiritual health, but you'll also have good and solid mental health. It doesn't mean that you won't have times when life is extremely difficult, but it will allow you to manage your emotions and your life thoughtfully. I'll finish with the story of my mother because I'm an Irishman and I'm allowed to do that. So my mother was an amazing woman. She was a devout Catholic who'd say, well, Denis, now we'll say our rosary, but we won't have any litany or that kind of stuff because then we'll have time for a little whiskey before we go to bed. A solid Catholic. And the last night she was conscious, actually, Philip, my friend, came up to visit. And he said to her, Mrs. Costello, how are you today? And she looked at him and she said, oh, Philip, you don't want to be asking that question, and I don't want to be answering it. Let's talk about something else. The woman had gangrene, had blown 2 valves in her heart, had osteoporosis, had pins in both hips and rush nails in each shoulder, and she was 70 pounds. She was a wise woman. She glowed with happiness because Philip wasn't allowed to ask that question and she didn't answer it. So mind what goes into your mind how you manage your moods, and love the body that God gave you, and you'll have solid mental health. Thank you.